Hi everyone, so today I want to explore modernity slash progress versus tradition in Tolstoy's famous work, Anna Karenina. I've actually had this book sitting on my shelf for quite a few years, and having read Tolstoy's War and Peace and really liked it, I knew I would eventually get to Anna Karenina. It's been said to be one of the greatest novels ever written, and it did not disappoint the expectations that I had for it. It's a huge work, and there's so many themes and so many brilliant ideas in this novel. But today, specifically, I'm going to focus exclusively just on this one theme that I think Tolstoy explores and does a really good job of, which is really modernity and progress versus tradition. And I don't think this is going to be like a sleepy academic exercise, because I think this discussion that he has is super relevant and extremely relevant, actually, to just the modern times that we live in. And I think the commentary and some of his critiques and ideas that he has on the just progress and the continuation of that is extremely relevant to us today. So from the Industrial Revolution, with the invention of various machines to solve material problems, and the current discussions about AI and what trajectory that's going to lead us to, really our world is faced with even more rapid technological progress, and it's happening at an accelerating pace. And this was happening at Tolstoy's time too. So I think whatever critiques that he has and commentary, I think, is extremely relevant to us today and is well worth exploring. So I think an excellent framework to view and understand this conception that we're going to discuss is Plato's hierarchy of desires. I think it's a good conception and a good lens to go and explore this concept through. Specifically, I think it'll ground Anna and Vronsky's behavior compared to Levin, and it's just one lens that lets us view their behavior and form. Additionally, I think it's also a good view on just how to view overall human desire, by considering the traditional view here as more divine ideas, contrasted with like the baseness of Anna and Vronsky's relationship. I think Plato's classification really bears mentioning here before we go on this exploration. So in his view, the highest being reason, intellectual and philosophical, truth, wisdom, art, abstract math, and other things of that nature, compared to, say, the base, like the physical and the instinctual, food, drink, sex, money. Plato described these appetites as kind of part of the soul, being a multi-headed beast. So these are kind of all base, and they're all shared with like all the animals, but he mentions that specifically the base desires are only exclusively to the domain of like animals, like swine and animals, right? They're not, you'll never see like animals doing abstract math or philosophy or art. It's just not in their capabilities to do so. But human beings possess this kind of ability to be both, right? Man kind of being as an in-between being, in a Nietzschean sense of being between both an animal and sort of like a god. So man has both these capabilities, of course, like which ones he exercises and which ones he chooses to focus on. That's kind of the point here and why I'm bringing this framework up. Right, so a pig can't really appreciate art, math, philosophy. And the thing is, Plato mentions if these are left unchecked, these desires are insatiable and lead to a chaotic life. And we actually see this transpire in the novel between Anna and Vronsky's relationship. It can best be described as chaotic and dramatic throughout the entire thing, and then especially including towards the end. And it ultimately actually ends in Anna's death and like Vronsky's like attempt at unaliving himself at one point. So it really does seem that what Plato is saying, where like if you embrace these kind of chaotic desires, like it eventually leads to this like a chaotic outcome. So, and then I think there's a quote from Mill: "It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." This is a notion kind of also from Nietzsche as well, where he describes man as an in-between being and the animal and the Übermensch, which I just mentioned. So the man can kind of be seen as being straddling these 2 points. He possesses both the animal and the divine, and the ability to choose freely and exercise these is kind of the key point that makes human beings human. Now, which ones we choose to engage with and which ones we choose to exercise, that's kind of the point here. And both the characters make this choice during the novel. So I want to draw attention here to two things that show up in the novel, which is mainly the countryside versus the city, whether it's Moscow or St. Petersburg in the novel, but also like the countryside where Levin lives. And I think it's a good framework. It's not perfect, but basically his life, like Levin's life in the countryside, is kind of depicted as slow moving, serene. Labor there in the countryside is seen as a virtue, a cure for the soul, while Anna's world in the city is kind of a world of performative gossip and artificiality. It's a space really of hedonistic leisure and ego games with like the court and all the kind of like higher up classes just basically meeting up to discuss nothing of really importance. And then before that, we explore Levin's world in the countryside. I want to mention that human beings and the earth are inextricably connected. Man's materiality is actually in his very name. So the word human has a deep literal connection to the earth and the soil. Linguistically, being human is defined as being earthborn or of the ground, and the etymology of the word goes to humus. Latin scholars trace humanist back to the word humus, which literally means earth, soil, or ground. So in man's very definition, we end up kind of seeing this notion of earth and soil. And this is so important, I think, to keep in mind as Levin performs his like farming and engagements with the soil in the countryside. It's kind of seen as this natural place and kernel of human beings and their engagement with the world. So it doesn't have that artificiality. So specifically in Levin's world in the countryside, labor plays a big part both in his contentment and in curing issues he might have, particularly after his rejection. When he first proposes to Kitty and gets rejected, he goes back to the countryside to kind of heal, and through labor cultivates and heals from his feelings. He also does like hunting at the time and other like engagements, and I'm going to put up a quote here about his like hunting experience where he kind of describes like the meadows and the birds chirping and just kind of the serene like view of nature and that's depicted in the countryside. This really depicts like a quiet, slow, serene life compared to the chaos and energy that infiltrates Moscow or St. Petersburg. One also sees order and structure in the countryside, partly through nature and its order, but also in more rigid social structures and understanding of like the peasants and the landowners and how their relationship goes, right? So the peasants know their relationship to the landowner. There's no really confusion or anything relating to that. And I'll put up a quote here about like the peasants and kind of that relationship that they have in the countryside. My whole point being not to say like this is I'm not even assigning like a value judgment to this in this case. I'm just merely pointing to the fact that in the traditional countryside, there is rigid order and structure, which seems to be lacking in the city. Albeit in the city, things are more free flowing and people kind of are more free to break social conventions and structures, which does not seem to be the case in the countryside. And this quote that I put up here is really more just a discussion between some of the landowners, where many are upset that the peasants work the land, but they're against new and more efficient and productive technologies. So in the countryside, the peasants symbolizing kind of this rejection, this Luddite vision, this reactionary vision to technology and its progression. They're reactionary and they stick to their traditional methods that they know. They don't embrace technology and its advancements. They prefer to continue doing things the old way. So the countryside is presented as this location that does not embrace technology to the degree of the city. Reach another important point here, I think, as human beings are tied to the earth and aspects of materiality and central and kind of to this notion of entropy and chaos. For man to basically hold these forces at bay, we have to rely on technology and reason and progress to solve these issues. For example, in the case of farming and working the land, that's central in the countryside for Levin. But let's say like the weather, which is like a entropic force, right, decides to randomly not cooperate for that year, that can have really horrible consequences in terms of flood and just availability of food, right? So the peasants and many other people can die if there's like a big famine due to these entropic weather conditions. And that has happened in history, right? Like in many different stages in history. So through technology, it might be possible to at least partially mitigate this issue and basically extract a higher yield, surviving in the process. And I'm going to mention here basically kind of this quote here, and it's talking about how the peasants in Levin are working the land and like how they're mowing and they're sweating, there's sweat they're dripping down their face from their nose, and it's just kind of depicting this labor, and it's very monotonic and they're very engaged. So in the countryside, a hard day's labor is seen as a virtue, especially for Levin. Like he sees this as like a very virtuous activity. And I believe Tolstoy, of course, was like a very big fan of the peasantry and their way of life, and like he tried to integrate with them, and he really respected and admired their lifestyle and their dedication to labor, which he, I guess, viewed as like more essential and perfect compared to the other superficialities of the city. So we really do see that there's a joy in exerting one's human nature and form, and there's gaining productivity from this as well. And we see really that this really contrasts the city, where Levin points out later that he experiences as kind of frivolous, hedonistic, and engaging in these like social circles that gossip, and all the while the people there dislike each other, and it's kind of this meaningless activity and leisure, which is contrasted to the countryside. And then continuing from that quote, like Levin describes how eventually in him there's this change that takes place in his work, which gives him this enormous pleasure. In the midst of his work, moments came to him where he forgot that he was doing, and he kind of feels this light. He basically, like, he's locked in, he's in the zone, he's really focused. And then after working for some time, he really gets to experience the joy of being in the zone. It's similar to like Heidegger when he talks about the hammer and the nail, how when everything is working at its like highest state, no one is aware of the tool use or the usage of tools. It's kind of this like flow state where the tool becomes almost an extension of you, and you become extremely focused in that process. And that's what I think is going on here. In his engagement with the earth, Levin is performing one of the most traditional and direct experiences, arguably most authentic to human life. However, later in the novel, we do get a glimpse of Levin in the city, and I'll put up a quote here of Levin at the end, in the city. This is more towards the end of the novel, where he's in Moscow after Kitty gives birth, but he's talking about how he's been stuck in these unproductive and like expensive engagements, and it's so strange for him that these things are happening here in the city. That's totally different. So he kind of sees the impact of the location on his character. In the country, I would say he's more himself, but he becomes like a kind of a different man in the city compared to the countryside. And he's also looser with his expenses and surprised with the ease that he adapts to this world. In a sense, this is the corrupting nature of the urban environment, where anyone can kind of fall prey to this expectations. And of course, the city, like as an industrial construction, especially as an aggregate of the notion of progress, technology, compared to like tradition and the old way of doing things. And then of course we have Anna. In contrast, she spends most of her time in the city, in high society glamour and seeking out of individual pleasures over duty. We see looser moral virtues, lack of stable structures that I mentioned. She represents kind of this new Russia. Her life is defined by St. Petersburg, the railway, individuality of desire over any form of duty. And then Vronsky and Anna, kind of, there's this scene where they're sitting at the table, and they become this, it's kind of like indecent, but it's like in public society in St. Petersburg. We see in the social setting of the city, these transgressions are permissible, even in the open view of others, as well as her husband. Anna and Vronsky engage and like flirt with each other. Whatever their desire is, the truth is there's no sense of duty. But as I mentioned, kind of this like platonic stratification earlier, this is they're kind of engaging in one of the more like base modes of being and desires. I would say equivalent to the animal, say a pig being hungry and gratifying their desire immediately with no thought to repercussions or like the situation that it finds itself in, right? Like, as animals are not capable of doing that, but human beings are. It's just that we can freely choose which one to engage with, and here they're choosing to engage with this more base desire compared to, like, say, Anna, for example, sticking to her husband out of duty, and Vronsky respecting that structure, that social structure, which he's not. So there's kind of this higher order and mediation of reason, right, that I mentioned earlier in Plato. But behaving this way, they're kind of engaging in the lowest form of human capabilities and capacities, while they could be engaging in the higher ones. And then Anna mentions again, there's, of course, the fact is that Anna eventually kind of like pays this price for this behavior, right? So she gets cast out from society, and she gets basically, there's like a scene in the box that I'm going to put here, like a quote from, And as I mentioned earlier in Plato, kind of this engagement with base desires leads to chaos. So we begin to see really the fallout of their antisocial environment, right? So they get to gratify their immediate hedonistic desires, but at the price of rejection and alienation from society, where basically everyone in all the different cities kind of looks down on them as outcasts, and this is kind of the chaotic part of the chaotic aspect that they get to suffer due to their choice earlier. This kind of makes sense, right? Because in a civilization or society, to reject this behavior, if everyone kind of acted this way, it was very unlikely that like civilization would be able to persist. It would just lead to chaos and ruin. And from such an unstable foundation, it's really hard to imagine how anything higher, like civilizationally wise, could be built. So maybe the people criticizing them are onto something, that like you can't build stable structures if you can't have like a stable foundation, and like everybody behave this way basically. And we really get an amazing distinction between tradition and modernity as it takes place in the city. Vronsky has this quote that I'm going to put up. It's kind of quite big, but I'm going to just touch on it a little bit, because I think it's really important in capturing the ideology that he ascribes to. He says, all the people were divided in St. Petersburg into two completely opposite sorts. One was the inferior, the banal, stupid, above all ridiculous, who believed that a husband should live with one wife whom he has married in church, and that a girl should be innocent, a woman modest. I'm not going to read this whole quote here for you, like you can see it and read it, but basically he criticizes kind of these old traditional values that for example, probably Tolstoy is adhering to and going forward. But then he mentions all these the opposite, right? Like, so he wants basically anything goes, no stable structures, everything, there's nothing seriously to be taken, everything is kind of a joke, everything is transgressible, there's no structure, everything is permissible basically, right? And I don't think Tolstoy touches much on this. I think it's more other thinkers, but part of this aspect of decline of modernity, of course, like technology and progress impact this and impact all these things, but of course religion and the downfall of religion has been a huge aspect, right? The famous Dostoevsky quote of, if there is no God, everything is permissible. And I think that also ties into it here, except Tolstoy I don't think touches too much on it. He does touch on religion and divinity and all these ideas, but I don't think he ever mentioned this, or at least I can't recall where in the work if he did. But we basically see Vronsky contrast here. He's telling of the ideology of the city versus the rural. In the city, anything goes, and the more scandalous, dramatic, hedonistic, and sensational, the more virtuous in his mind. All tradition and virtues are rejected, scorned, and only ridiculous people are adhere to them in his view. And then I think Tolstoy again kind of has this excellent foresight at the dynamics that are going on in play here. One can argue that this dynamic really still kind of persists between like the hedonistic city life versus like the more rural areas in any location, I would imagine. And then kind of continuing off this like hedonistic, chaotic aspect, we get to like a later stage in Anna and Vronsky's relationship where things are falling apart, and Anna is kind of in this like frenzy and this rage, like almost like the Bacchanalian, like something from the like Greek like Dionysian Bacchanalian revelry, where like she has no control, like she's going through this like raving throughout the city after Vronsky goes on like a trip. And then she kind of talks about specifically about how can anybody really know what anybody else is thinking. And then I really think this is the point where the cost of her and Vronsky's actions come due, because Vronsky now, he can't really legally marry her, as they've kind of transgressed against society and religion, and they're cast out of society, and no one wants to engage with them. It's as if they're kind of carrying a social plague, so the price has really been steep. And all this kind of started with the chaos that they sowed earlier, and it kind of begins to suspect Vronsky of infidelity and not loving her, and this kind of seems to reinforce this destructive loop that begins to happen in their relationship. And I think this is a big difference, is that we don't see this in Levin and Kitty's relationship. I'll touch on that a little bit more later, but really it's kind of this thing where even though they have a child together, they're like view their child as in this very like disinterested, almost cold way. Like the child is not very talked about too often, and it's always mentioned how Hannah doesn't really care about her child. Like it's kind of just a side thing, like just there, which is very strange and very different compared to Levin and Anna's Levin and Kitty's relationship, because and I'll discuss this a little bit more, but Kitty and Levin's relationship really leads to this like telos and culmination in the creation of a child. And then I'll get to the point where like how Levin speaks about that and how high he views that kind of process. And then here it's contrasted with Anna and Vronsky's thing, where things are just falling apart and the child is kind of just like a side thing. It's not even mentioned seriously. And then, yeah, so Anna, they kind of get into this chaotic frenzy, and Anna eventually ends up engaging in the ultimate nihilistic action of unaliving herself. And then I'll kind of put the scene, like how I think Tolstoy does a great job of describing it. And of course, it's brilliant here that it's kind of this probably one of the most like key symbolic modern acts and failings of technological progression. And we also kind of see that it's actually like a train, like at the time, like this was like more modern developments. These things are kind of new, right? So the train and representing progression and technology, that's what actually ends up like ending Anna. So that's, I think, symbolically not lost here in Tolstoy. So basically, yeah, I think it's important to know that the agent assisting in this act is like a machine of progress and modernity. The train is the productivity enhancing super technology of the time. Although it drastically solves a lot of like human issues, like so many material struggles, right? Like reducing distances to basically like a way shorter time frame. You don't have to like spend days to go to a location. It takes maybe like hours. So it really is kind of solving this issue, but it really, although technology fixes our material problems, it does not fix our psychological problems and or psychological ailings. So this is really prevalent today, and I think Tolstoy exactly had this in mind in his foresight when he was looking forward in this direction, as we kind of see this historical arc of progress and the continuation and basically his criticism of it. All right, well, that's it, guys, for today. Thank you for watching. I know this was kind of a long one. I mean, it's, what can you expect when you're going through Tolstoy's work? And I only touched on like a small theme that I personally thought was interesting, worth exploring. There's like many others, but I think for now, this is it. I'll probably be making some other videos on some other works soon. So stay tuned, like, comment, subscribe, follow me on my social. And yeah, keep in touch with, let me know what your ideas and thoughts are about the work. I definitely don't think this is perfect, and I personally myself am not sure which side I fall on. And do I completely ascribe to tradition, or do I completely accept modernity in its accelerating aspect? I don't know. I think there's aspects of both that I find virtuous and like, but then there's other aspects that I think detract and are very concerning for both positions. So it's really, I think, this kind of like human tragic dilemma. But yeah, thank you again for watching. I'm going to be exploring some other works later on, and I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you for watching. Bye.